And it is an enormous relational database. And it's also a social networking site. What I have been interested by in the press is that when it gets mentioned, there's this sort of scoffing about why do knitters need a social site, completely ignoring the technical aspect of what it is that's been done. So this is a huge database that you can get at, since it's relational, from sort of any direction, that has patterns and yarns and projects people have made, the photographs they've taken of them, their notes on the patterns, who's knitting the patterns, and you can go from sort of any direction. So you can see what an individual has knitted, you can see what's been done by a certain designer, what products have been knitted in a particular yarn. And this amount of information suddenly being available to knitters it's just an explosion. It's so exciting. I used to own a yarn store, as I mentioned, and yarn store owners know that if a pattern is printed and a sweater is shown in one color, that maybe 30% of the people who knit that sweater are going to ask for the yarn in the color the picture showed up in the magazine. It breaks your heart. You know that they could make it in any color they wanted. And they say, oh, but you know, it looks so nice there, it's lime green there, I want the lime green. And suddenly, with Ravelry, you have access to pictures of other people who've knitted the sweater in a whole rainbow of colors. And it's my hope that now that that's available, that people will be able, even if they couldn't make the leap themselves, to have it sort of borne in on them that there's more to what they're doing and that there's more opportunity for creativity than they'd been letting themselves have. There's a very new project just in the last few months called KnitML, so Knit Markup Language. And this is a serious project that somebody has taken on to try to standardize knitting patterns. There are differences in how knitting patterns are written globally. So even in English, so we like to say that in England or Canada or the former Commonwealth and the United States, that we're divided by a single language. And that's true even in knitwear. So if you look at a pattern for knitting or crochet, the terms are all different, which is ridiculous. And if you take that further and look at other languages, say German or Italian or Japanese, the standards for how patterns are presented are all entirely different. But as the person who's setting up KnitML has pointed out, the functions that we're doing, the actual tasks that we're taking on, are standard. And that if we could code the instructions in a standardized way, then that could then cause another burst of creativity. Once all of that information, again, is brought together, we can go from that and explode outward again, because we're suddenly able to talk to each other about what it is we're doing. I will add a page, because I forgot to put it out on a slide, with lots of links for you. So I'll give the slides to the C3 folks, and there'll be an extra page that's not up here now. So yeah, that's just my information. So there are some terrific websites that I'd like to point you to. And if you're interested, I hope you'll look at the slides online to get a look at them. There's lots of information about how to knit on the internet. You can just pick up yarn and needles and learn how. And honestly, if any of you get yarn and needles over the next couple of days and you'd like to learn to knit, I would be happy to teach you. And I know that there are other knitters around, so if you sort of looked sad and had needles and yarn, somebody would probably help you. And again, that's in contrast to there's a sort of knitting industry, and this is one reason why I don't still have a yarn store. which thinks that they should charge hundreds of dollars for knitting classes, at least in New York City. And for something that you can learn how to do in 10 minutes, it's outrageous, and it's very upsetting. And it turns out that I'm not a very good capitalist. On that point, I'd like to end and see what questions people have, and if you have any thoughts about things that I left out, favorite geeky knitting products.
I wonder if you personally have any thoughts. I know recently online there was a huge furor over, there's a brand that has trademarked the name Stitch and Bitch.
Yeah.
I wonder if you have any thoughts on the commercialization of subversive knitting like that. I'm personally not a fan, and I kind of avoided that whole conglomerate of drama, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on it.
I do. And let me see if I can summarize for a group that might not know about that whole background. There is a book called Stitch and Bitch that a woman in New York City wrote and edited. And it turned out that some other company had trademarked the phrase Stitch and Bitch, which, again, is ridiculous. People have been using that term for their knitting groups for decades, and they sort of said, oh, well, we'll trademark it, and then nobody else can use it, and there was this huge kerfuffle about that. And as far as I know, Debbie Stoller is still able to use the phrasing for her books, but there's been some other stuff going on where like groups are told that they can't call themselves Stitch and Bitch groups. There's a second aspect of that where the books that Debbie produced try to be edgy in a way that feels very much to me like somebody kind of co-opting edginess. So the example that a friend of mine gives is it really subversive to buy a book for $20 at the bookstore so that you can take a graph of an anarchy symbol to knit it on your hat? If you really wanted an anarchy symbol on your hat, wouldn't you just have made it up yourself? Like, it's not really hard to graph an A in a circle. There's sort of projects like that that seem to me to be like, oh, we want to be hip. And as you can tell from my tone of voice, that's what I think about it. I don't think it's particularly punk or geeky or
I mean,
cool.
There's also craftster.org that they do basically the same thing, but better and more original-er. They're a lot better at it, but I wondered if anyone else had any thoughts on that, and it's nice to hear similar thoughts.
Sure. I see that somebody else has a question, and that's a sort of similar topic, so why don't we... Oh, I'm sorry, you were standing there, I thought you...
all right, over here.
Go ahead.
Is there kind of an obstacle to knitting right now, which you, I don't know, a point where you can't go further, where you need, I don't know, special yarn or something you will overcome, or is there something hard that people are working on to tackle right now?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Do you mean about an individual project, or just knitting?
I don't know. I don't know. In programming, you sometimes I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I appreciate the question.
You have a problem and you want to overcome it, like anonymizing your traffic and such a thing. But this is only software related. Is there something to knitting where you what you would like to have, but right now can't have?
Right. There's funny little things that do sometimes happen. Somebody, for instance, decided that it would be easier to knit socks not on 4 double-pointed needles, but using a long needle. And I could explain how that works, but it's a little tedious. But you pull out the cable, and so instead of switching back and forth between the shorter needles, you do this. But then that meant that you needed a very flexible knitting needle with a longer cable. And so, what's that? Yes, thank you. That's a very nice way to put it. It's mathematically congruent to doing it with 4 needles or doing it with 1 long needle. But then some people were kind of hacking together long cabled needles, and then some businesses stepped in and started producing long cabled needles. Sometimes there are things with certain aspects of yarn that come up where you want a yarn. For instance, there's superwash wool available now, so there's washable wool. And there was a sense before that wool was difficult to work with because you couldn't just put it in the washing machine. And now there's wool that's been treated so that it doesn't felt easily. And so then that's available. In terms of knitting patterns, I can't think of a thing that's a particular Mount Everest issue, but I know that people are always sort of pushing the boundaries of what it is that you can create with knitting, and it's pretty exciting.
Oh, okay. This is less of a question, but more of a comment. Just in case you are still looking for knitted objects,
sure,
you may be interested in an object that is an art object that was exhibited in Berlin a couple of years ago, but it was made by a French artist. It's called Volita, and it caused considerable protest by conservative yellow press. Mm-hmm. It's actually a knitted naked woman. You may find it sexist or not, but just in case you're interested, you may Google it up or stuff, and yeah.
Feel free to email me, or I will Google it. That sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
There's a knitted tank cozy that, if I thought about it, I might have put. I mean, many of you may have seen that already on Boing Boing. So I was trying to not. There's 2 knitted tank cozies.
I created pom-pom for both of them.
That's wonderful. So I was trying to not just use things that have been on Boing Boing, because that's so easy to do. But there's a woman who makes knitted figures for movies. It's a wonderful sort of geek thing. Dawn of the Dead, also Shaun of the Dead. And so there's these little zombie knitted creatures, and they're beautiful. And so, rather than painting miniatures, she's knitting them.
For people that have, like myself, 2 left hands, do you know of any fun things you can do with knitting machines?
I've only used knitting machines a little bit, and honestly, if the manual dexterity that it takes to run a home knitting machine is as high or higher than, I think, than learning to knit by hand. It's like any other physical task that you take on. It feels very awkward at first, and then there is a moment where you start to get the muscle memory in your hands, and you get the hang of it. But as for whether there are fun things to do with knitting machines, there certainly are. That's not a thing that I took on here, but you can do sort of programming of images. And so you can take multicolored images and program them and make really enormous pieces of knitted art, which obviously would appeal to a lot of folks here.
The way I see it, computer programming and knitting are 2 incredibly geeky activities, both with very unhealthy gender ratios,
yes.
Let's say. Might be a stereotype, but do you see any hope in getting a healthier gender ratio in knitting?
I've seen a little bit of progress on that as there are more knitters online. And I think that because a man can out himself as a knitter online in that way that, nobody's like right there watching you. So we talk about internet communication being anonymous. He isn't knitting on the train, he's knitting on the internet. And so I've been seeing a little bit. It's not much, but there's some. I was actually, and I forgot to put this slide back up, and I was annoyed to see this quote from the Knit a Please folks. This is their description of what it is they're doing, and that they did